Hello, friends and subscribers. Welcome back to the Daniel Rosehill podcast, being brought to you today from a very wet and dreary Jerusalem. This podcast now replicates onto my YouTube channel. So if you prefer to receive podcasts in audio format on YouTube, you can now go ahead and do so. There won't be anything happening in the background. It's a static image. So if you're cooking or you are commuting or you've some other thing to do and you want to give me 5 minutes of your headspace, please put it on background play and let me talk to you. So what I want to do today is something that I haven't done really before on this YouTube channel, and that is read someone else's document. I'm going to call this a reading. And basically, well, what we're currently seeing is at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. Today we've seen the opening of proceedings instituted by South Africa against the state of Israel. Israel is beginning its defense tomorrow. South Africa has brought an application alleging that Israel is committing genocide in violation of a multilateral commitment against genocide to which Israel is a signatory. And we've seen the opening arguments by the South African team. And to the best of my knowledge, it's going to be tomorrow, Friday, that Israel will begin its verbal defense against this application. Anyone wanting to read the application, the proceedings application authored by South Africa can do so. It's on the ICJ website. It's not difficult to find. It's an 84-page document, and I want to just state my bias at the outset here, which is that I think that this genocide allegation, not just in the form of it being made by South Africa, is completely without merit, and it is ridiculous and spurious and inflammatory, and I could go on throwing adjectives at it. But basically, my very simple non-legal defense of the genocide allegation would be that, well, Israel is, by all accounts, a very strong military. It's been pursuing this war intended very, very clearly to destroy Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad for over 3 months now. And we are still seeing the war slowly go on because Israel is trying to safeguard the civilian population while pursuing its enemies bent on its destruction. If Israel, being such a massive military power, if it wanted to commit this genocide and ethnic cleansing that isn't happening, then that could have been completed in days or maybe even a week. So the fact that this is taking so long and that Israel is opening evacuation corridors and dropping leaflets to tell ordinary Gazan civilians where to go are all extremely powerful indications that there is no genocide happening. Israel is pursuing a military campaign, and it cheapens the term genocide when it actually has legitimate application, as we have seen over the course of the past century. There's other things, on Twitter, people are always continuously showing this graph of the Palestinian population growing, but I don't even think it's necessary to get into that level of detail, although that is also another strong way of disproving the genocide allegation. But just look at the facts on the ground, and anyone with a brain could see that there is no genocide happening. So that is my response to the South African document. But then again, I am not an international lawyer, and I'm certainly have no intention of traveling to The Hague tomorrow. Though fun fact that I'll throw in, the International Court of Justice is based in The Hague. I actually lived in The Hague, believe it or not, for about a year when I was a child. True story. Had to do with my family moving between different countries. Okay, so I'm going to just read this document, and this is really centered on Amalek. For anyone who watched the South African arguments today, and they're up there on the UN website, you can watch their arguments. They actually really, really honed in on this, and it's kind of bizarre. In the Jewish Bible, there is this commandment to wipe out Amalek, and Amalek is kind of seen as a metaphor for the enemies of the Jewish people. And the South African argument has rather bizarrely taken a couple of loose statements where Israeli leaders use this, refers to this biblical commandment in the Jewish Torah and said, hey, this is actually these are the instructions to the troops on the ground. So this is a legal opinion from the Israel Democracy Institute's advocate Shlomit Ravitsky Tur Paz. I want to emphasize that this is not the official defense of the state of Israel. That, to the best of my knowledge, begins tomorrow. And this is focusing really on that aspect of their argument. So I'm just going to go ahead now and read, and hope this does it justice. Legal opinion on the allegation submitted to the ICJ in The Hague, stating that references to the term Amalek imply a clear intention to commit genocide, authored on January the 10th, which was just yesterday, by advocate Shlomit Ravitsky Tur Paz. In December of 2023, the Republic of South Africa submitted to the International Court of Justice in The Hague a complaint against the State of Israel, alleging that it is committing genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. One claim included in its application is that the many references by senior members of the Israeli government and the military to the biblical precept to wipe out the memory of the ancient Amalekites is evidence of a real and present intention to commit genocide. Thus, Section 101 of the application quotes a remark by the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, on October the 28th of 2023. "You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible, and we do remember." And there is a footnote here that says, here the application relies on an inaccurate English translation. All standard translations of the verse employ the past tense, what Amalek did to you in the past, and not the present perfect, which indicates a continuing action and the implication that Amalek is still active today. The difference is significant. Netanyahu actually said, "We were commanded." He did not mention our Holy Bible. It also quotes, albeit incorrectly, see below, that's the footnote we've just discussed, from a letter that the Prime Minister sent to soldiers and officers on November the 3rd of 2023, in which he again quoted the biblical verse, "Remember what Amalek did to you." In paragraph 103, the application refers to soldiers who, on December 12th, 2023, sang a song with the lyrics being, "It is our duty to wipe out the seed of Amalek." Paragraph 105 refers to MK Boaz Bismuth's post on X, October 16th, 2023, that the memory of Amalek must be protested. And this video of these soldiers singing about Amalek was actually broadcast in the court today. This is how desperate South Africa is to prove that this any references by Jews to Amalek. And to my mind, this is nonsensical, because even if we see Amalek as as a metaphor for the enemies of Israel, in that case, this would be referring to Hamas, not the Palestinian people at large. But anyway, I digress as my opinion. So let's just get back to the document. I hereby state my professional opinion with regard to the meaning of these locutions and the use made of them in the application. Forward. Under the impact of the bloody conflict that has raged for years, and certainly after the atrocities of October 7th, Israeli citizens and elected officials have been voicing harsh, belligerent, and irresponsible statements about the enemy. This is the typical discourse of the home front in wartime anywhere in the world, and should certainly be condemned. But by no means do these sentiments guide the actions of the combat units and the operational commands issued to them, which strictly distinguish between uninvolved populations from members of Hamas. The application quoted a long string of statements but amplified out of all proportion their influence on Israelis' actual state of mind and on the policy of the State of Israel. A correct understanding of statements about Amalek and Simeon and Levi requires knowledge of the historical and cultural context in which they originated, of the Jewish interpretation of these terms, and of the weight assigned to them in Jewish history. The present document does not pretend to discuss the intentions of any individual who made such statements, but only asserts that the use of such terminology does not constitute an actual call to genocide. 3. The effective deletion from the Jewish law book of the precept to wipe out Amalek. In post-biblical Jewish culture, the precept to wipe out the biblical tribe of Amalek was remote from the real world and deemed an obligation that was no longer in effect. In practice, Jewish law is determined not only by the Bible and its commandments, the written Torah, but also and mainly by how they have been interpreted over the generations by the sages, the oral Torah. This is how Jewish tradition constantly adapts the ancient text to suit the needs, circumstances, and challenges of each age, while maintaining an unbroken and intact line of transmission from generation to generation and sustaining the text's moral and ethical demands. The Bible remains the source of Jewish belief, history, and principles, but some of its precepts are no longer understood literally. When persons who are at home in Jewish culture hear the name Amalek, they do not hear a call for annihilation, but only the echo of a villain who lived thousands of years ago, a foe who can no longer be identified today, and has no physical descendants, but only ideological heirs. That's very important. For example, In the 12th century, the greatest sage of Jewish history, Maimonides, wrote that, although in principle the command to wipe out Amalek continues to be valid from generation to generation, the target of that precept, the Amalekite people, have vanished from the world and the stage of history. Quote, their remnants scattered and mixed in with the other nations until none of them remains. Unquote. In other words, the impossibility of identifying the descendants of Amalek effectively abrogates the precept to wipe out Amalek. Other traditional commentators defer fulfillment of the precept to the Messianic era, a distant and unidentifiable future, or abolish the commandment as incumbent on human beings and leave it to the exclusive responsibility of the deity, a heavenly law rather than a human law, citing the verse in Exodus, quote, the Lord will be at war with Amalek from generation to generation, unquote. The war against evil is indeed an eternal war, but it is not a human task or affair and is waged by God alone. Another line taken by the commentators turns the concrete biblical war against the people of Amalek into a battle against the concept of evil and violence represented by Amalek. Human beings do bear responsibility, but it has nothing to do with the killing and physical destruction. We see that the Jewish legal tradition abolished the precept to wipe out Amalek on the practical level, just as it did for other precepts that may have been acceptable in the ancient Near East thousands of years ago, but that over the generations has been discarded and have become dead letters. Amalek as a cultural myth that has nothing to do with concrete action. Every culture adopts ancient myths, for better or for worse. In Jewish culture, the biblical Amalek is a metaphor for iniquity and evil. Uttering the name Amalek is not a call for action, but rather the expression of deep psychological shock in the face of pure evil. The word was whispered with panic and fear whenever Jews, weak and defenseless, were attacked throughout history. The terror inspired by Amalek's spiritual descendants reigned in the ghettos and extermination camps of the Second World War during the Holocaust. When contemporary political and military leaders describe murder, terrorism, and injustice, it is no wonder that Amalek is a term that comes to their mind. The misquoting of the verse and its context. The application, referring to the South African application, cites two occasions when Prime Minister Netanyahu made use of the verse, "Remember what Amalek did to you." In fact, with regard to the second occasion, the application does not quote the verse actually spoken by the Prime Minister, which deals with a historical memory, but instead refers to a verse from a different book of the Bible, a one-time directive by a prophet to the king of Israel some 3,000 years ago to show the Amalekites no mercy. The quotation of the wrong verse and the attempt to interpret it as an instruction to commit genocide is misleading. It diverts attention from what Netanyahu actually said, a verse that prescribes later generations' obligation to remember the attack on the people of Israel more than 3 millennia ago. That verse fits the context of Netanyahu's remarks on October 28th when he was speaking about the bitter historical memory of the Jewish people, who have been persecuted in every generation. He continued, "We have always said never again. Never again is now." This line was quoted by Margaritis Schinas, the Vice President of the European Commission, on November the 5th, 2023. When he published a statement about the increase in the number of anti-Semitic incidents taking place in Europe. Hate has no place in the European Union. Never again is now. References to Amalek provide a painful historical context to the Jewish people's constant struggle for life and liberty, as Prime Minister Netanyahu wrote in the letter to the troops quoted in the application. The current battle against the Hamas murderers is another chapter in the story of our national resistance over the generations. We are all the scions of a line of heroes who were not deterred and did not retreat. Joshua, Deborah, King David, Judah, Maccabee. The target of the quotation. As is apparent from the remarks by the Prime Minister and those of other senior officials about the historical precept to remember Amalek's deed, they are comparing the wickedness of Amalek to the Hamas murderers and not to the Palestinian people. This is a point that I made just a few minutes ago. It is a protest against vile criminal acts, not against an ethnic group, not against national identity, and not against the residents of a specific region. The conceptual leap the application makes from the mythical, cultural, and literary use of metaphors and symbols to the current situation and operation is incoherent and is unjustifiable. The biblical code obligates the Jewish people to adhere to laws of war. The biblical Amalekites became the classic foe of the Israelites and Jewish people because they were seen as a merciless enemy that exploited every weakness and adhered to no moral principles in combat. He surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. Amalek was the first nation to attack the Israelites after they left Egypt. It was seen as the polar antithesis of the biblical Israelites, who were bound by a higher standard of morality in combat than other ancient peoples, in keeping with the dictum, "Your camp must be holy." To a large extent, humanity's earliest laws of war are found in the Bible. Long before the modern West, the Bible stipulated rules of war that set limits on plunder and on the abuse of prisoners, banned the destruction of fruit-bearing trees unless absolutely necessary, the obligation when besieging a town to leave open a forced side, what today we call a humanitarian corridor, so that civilians not involved in the fighting can escape, and even mandated a duty to propose peaceful terms before launching an attack on a city, and if they are accepted, to call off the war. This last law, according to Maimonides, applies even to the mythical Amalekites. If they agree to peace and accept the bare minimum of universal ethical principles, the 7 Noahide laws, then they are no longer Amalek. This is quite incompatible with the idea of genocide, which is based entirely on race and ignores how a people conduct themselves. In all the biblical appearances of Amalek, they threaten to annihilate the Israelites, who must take arms to resist them. This was the case right after the exodus from Egypt, when a new people of former slaves was taking its first steps through the wilderness. But Amalek tried to keep it from being born, and again in the book of Esther, when Haman the Agagite, a descendant of Amalek, sought to destroy, massacre and exterminate all the Jews, young and old, children and women. Precisely the goal proclaimed by Hamas today. 6. Simeon and Levi, ethical censure in the Bible. Section 2 of the South African application refers to a battalion commander who released a video on December the 21st, 2023, in which he reported that the IDF had entered Beit Hanun and acted there in the same way as the biblical Simeon and Levi did in Nablus. The biblical narrative reports that Jacob's sons slew all the males of Shechem, now Nablus, when they were weak, after they had been circumcised, in the hope that Jacob would agree for their prince to marry his daughter Dinah, even though he had abducted and raped her. The application would portray the two brothers as biblical heroes whom today's soldiers are eager to emulate. Because the current debate relates to biblical concepts and myths and to how they are understood by Jewish soldiers today, we need to consider how Jewish tradition sees the story of Jacob, Simeon, Levi, and Dinah. Simeon and Levi are not triumphant heroes who win praise and glory. Quite the opposite. In the wake of their action, the two brothers are condemned and rejected by their father. The biblical account judges them harshly. Immediately after the massacre, and again right before his death, their father criticizes them severely, lashing out at them with moral censure, rejection, ostracism, and a curse instead of a blessing. The state of Israel does not wish to follow the paths of Simeon and Levi or repeat their destiny. Conclusion. To sum up, we assert that the application, which sees references to the biblical tribe of Amalek as equivalent to a call for genocide, is mistaken and misleading. 1. The precept to wipe out Amalek, which it cites, has in fact been deleted from the Jewish law book and become a dead letter. 2. The application misquotes the Prime Minister, citing the wrong verse, and fails to distinguish between remembering and wiping out Amalek. 3. The application fails to note that when Israeli speakers mention Amalek, they note that they are referring to members of Hamas and not to the Palestinian people in Gaza. 4. The Jewish people have been committed to stringent laws of war since they came into being more than 3,000 years ago. 5. The Bible does not see Simeon and Levi as role models to be emulated, given that their deed led to their censure and ostracism. That concludes the legal opinion, by Advocate Shlomit Ravitsky Tur Paz. I think it's a little bit ridiculous that we're actually seriously talking about Amalek, and that there's a whole legal document necessary to reject such a ridiculous claim. But as we're seeing today in The Hague, in the ICJ, South African lawyers are actually arguing before supposedly the most elevated court in the world that the biblical story of Amalek is actually providing ideological inspiration to the Israel Defense Forces, the troops on the ground, to commit some kind of genocide, when it just it doesn't make sense. I mean, as this document has gone at lengths to say, even the simple idea that Amalek as a metaphor for evil, for a unmerciful enemy and as an evil enemy, that maps onto Hamas, not to the population. So it just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, I thought nevertheless I would read that because it's just about the only sort of formal document that I could find. I imagine Israel hasn't had a chance to prepare something. I don't know if there will be a document summarizing their argument, but we will see their argument being advanced from tomorrow, being led by a very senior Israel sending a 4-person team to The Hague, being led by a very senior British advocate who is an expert on the law of genocide. And hopefully we can ground that argument in practical debates and not about this bizarre reference to Amalek that South Africa have dredged up in their ridiculous attempt to portray Israel as committing a genocide in Gaza, a total misrepresentation of its legitimate war of self-defense intended to protect its people. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Daniel Rosehill podcast. Please do consider subscribing, whether on a podcatching app or if you want to also get my video content, join the YouTube channel where these podcasts are replicated. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.